I tell you what, it's not like the olden days. I'm Jake.
I'm Rosie.
And this is our third podcast on the olden days. This time on the subject of the Masters of the Universe franchise. Masters of the Universe started out as a toy line from Mattel in the early 1980s, a series of muscular action figures. And they came with these little mini-comics. Each figure had a mini-comic accompanying it, which told the story of the struggle between good and evil on the planet Eternia. And in order to market these action figures to a very wide audience, a cartoon series was developed from the action figures and the mini-comics. The cartoon series, entitled He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, ran from 1983 to 1985, 2 seasons of 65 episodes each. And the very interesting thing about that is that the ideas from the mini-comics were adapted into the series, but some turned out very, very different on screen. So when you watch He-Man or read about He-Man in a comic or annual or colouring book or something, you'll often spot changes that have happened in the mythos and some of the characters. So let's talk about the cartoon first. Perhaps Rosie will tell us what she thinks of the original He-Man cartoon.
Yes, as you can tell, Jake's the He-Man expert. I don't really remember thinking anything very much when we watched the cartoon as little children, but I do remember watching it. All I can say for sure is that I used to enjoy Cringer and Battle Cat because I like animals.
He-Man was repeated on ITV in this country long past 1985, of course, which is why we can both remember watching it. It may have been repeated into the early 90s, but certainly the late 80s. And when I was very, very small, before I discovered Nightmare, it was my absolute favourite TV programme, my favourite thing, perhaps, in the whole world. I used to absolutely love the adventures that unfolded on Eternia, and I think a big thing that attracts children to the cartoon is some of the catchphrases and bits of repetition that you get. We've certainly discussed on some of our episode commentaries for Nightmare and perhaps Raven, and I don't think we mentioned it on this, how young audiences do like repetition, don't they? Familiar scenes, catchphrases, sequences that you can come back to and feel comfortable with every time you watch the show.
Yes, I do remember actually it was very reassuring sitting down to watch He-Man, and it's always starting with the I am Adam, Prince of Eternia speech.
That is the big one, isn't it? Every episode begins with the introductory speech explaining the premise and some of the characters, which is absolutely wonderful. And of course when Prince Adam takes out his sword and declares by the power of Grayskull in each episode, you know that you're going to see the familiar transformation sequence, which I used to absolutely love seeing and hearing every time. Unless, of course, there's a bit of a spanner in the works and he can't change into He-Man yet for some reason. That's always adds a bit of excitement to certain episodes of the cartoon.
Yes, you always know when he's going to try, because of Filmation not getting very much money from Mattel, because Mattel was so corporation-y and they made money, and they still are. He would always be standing in the same position, wouldn't he, when he was about to get his sword out.
And of course they have the stock use of the voice by the power of Grayskull. Whatever tone Prince Adam is speaking in, he'll revert to the stock by the power of Grayskull, and sometimes it sounds very obvious that he's not saying it as a continuous sentence.
But any problems like that must be blamed on Mattel for being penny pinchers, not Filmation, because they really did make the best of what they had, didn't they?
Filmation is notorious for cheap-looking animation, and as Rosie says, it's rather harsh on them. They do the best with the budgets and time that they were given. Filmation used a lot of stock animation, which is where they would overlay different characters over the same animation sequences, and you can see what bit of animation is being used several times in the same episode. But they use it to such great effect to tell the story in the best way that they can, which is an art form and something that Filmation does very well. We don't see a lot of Filmation's work over here on terrestrial television. The only other cartoon that they really bothered showing over here was Brave Star, but perhaps we'll talk about that another day.
I'm sure we will. The important thing with anything on television, for us certainly, is not what it looks like, but what the characters are like and what the plots are like and whether the story's any good. And He-Man isn't one of my very, very favourite things, but I can see why people like it, and they do their story very, very well.
Of course, I used to notice even when I was little that sometimes He-Man would have his sword and throw it, and then the next minute it'd be back on his back in its sheath and things like that. But it doesn't really matter because it does tell the story so well and do the characters so well. It really is a character-driven show, He-Man, and what the die-hard fans really love about it, I think, is the great characterization that you get through it. Perhaps it's a good opportunity to mention the main characters. We've talked about Prince Adam, of course, Prince of Eternia, who transformed into He-Man, and his pet Eternian tiger was Cringer, a cowardly character who transformed into the braver Battle Cat, who had armour as well, so he was all ready for battle physically and emotionally. And the interesting thing about Prince Adam and He-Man was that Prince Adam had to pretend to be a cowardly, bumbling, stay out of the way, stay at home, useless, foppish prince kind of character to conceal the fact that he was He-Man, but He-Man was more reflective of his true personality. Whereas with Battle Cat and Cringer, it was the opposite, and Cringer's personality was seemingly changed by being physically changed into Battle Cat. Or was that just on an emotional level as well, and allowed Cringer to access his inner strength? So I expect so. So they're the main good guys, of course, and the main villain was Skeletor, an absolutely fantastic villain with the skull face, very, very striking when you're young, and indeed when you're older. And perhaps Skeletor is the villain who achieves most successfully the balance between being amusing and being genuinely threatening. Skeletor wanted to take over the universe, to become the master of the universe by stealing the secrets of Castle Grayskull. But he could also be used very much as a comedy character, and neither one of those aspects ever threatened the other. That's why I enjoy Skeletor so much.
Do you mean that he's the most successful at that in the world?
Well, that's a very interesting point.
Is it?
I think Skeletor, I would say, is the villain I've watched who does bridge that gap between those two aspects most successfully. Lord Fear does it awfully well on Nightmare.
Is he perhaps a bit too funny, though?
Yes, and I always get the sense that Lord Fear is much easier to defeat when it comes to the crunch than Skeletor, but that's partly because Lord Fear is part of a game show, where you have to defeat the final villain as part of the whole structure of the show.
Yeah, it's very different villains. Of course, Skeletor had magic powers, and how many magic powers he had depended on who wrote the episode, didn't it?
Yes, it has a lot of different writers, the original He-Man series. Skeletor's powers range from limitless to extremely limited. But different writers, will put different spins on different characters in a lot of different ways. And there were lots of other fantastic characters in the show. Skeletor had a lot of underlings, such as...
evil forces of Skeletor.
As it says in the introduction.
Yeah.
Trapjaw, Beastman, Merman, Evil Lyn, Triclops, possibly being the most well-known. And He-Man had a lot of allies as well. Man-at-Arms, and Orko, who knew the secret that Prince Adam and He-Man were the same person, as does the Sorceress of Castle Grayskull, and then there are plenty of other allies, Ram-Man, Stratos, and later introductions such as Buzz-Off,
Mechaneck,
Man-E-Faces,
I've forgotten the rest of them.
All highly marketable and with existing action figures. And sometimes, as new action figures came out, the characters would be introduced into the show. For example, Mossman is a character who turns up very late in He-Man's run. And when you see the action figure, you can see it's very clearly reused mould of the Beastman figure.
I think when they were making up Orko, they said children ought to like him, didn't they? And I think I did, because, I don't know, He's just sort of interesting to watch, isn't he? He has no face, and he wears a red dress, and he floats around. I think that's what I liked about him when I was young, and he has a funny voice. But actually, watching your DVDs, Jake, now that I'm older, I find his backstory quite interesting as well. He was a highly respected, very powerful magician on Troller, and he got sort of zapped to Eternia, didn't he? And his powers don't work very well there. And how many episodes does he actually return to Troller in?
Oh, there's a lot of Troller episodes. I'm sure it gets up into double figures in the end, particularly with She-Ra visiting Troller as well.
Crikey. So I guess he must like Eternia, because if he can go back to Troller, he could just stay there if he wanted.
Yes, that's right, and at the end of the very first Troller episode he has to say, I'm going to stay here on Eternia and battle Skeletor, and it's important, but maintain my links with Troller, and of course he has a girlfriend, fiancé there.
Ah, yes, Drael.
Drael.
You were quite surprised, I think, when I mentioned Drael once. You didn't know I'd really taken it in that much. But I like Orko's girlfriend, Drael. I think that's a very cute little ship they're having.
Yes, Orko is very much there to be the eyes and sometimes the voice of the young audience, which is why he has to be in on the secret that Prince Adam and He-Man are the same person, because we're in on the secret.
Ah, yes.
But it does annoy me sometimes how Orko gets treated like a child on the show by some of the characters, Man-at-Arms in particular. It's even more annoying when Prince Adam does it, because we know Orko is a lot older than Prince Adam, actually. But if you consider that Orko has been on Eternia for about 10 years, and before that he'd built up this reputation on Troller as this great sorcerer, Orko the Great, you have to say he's got to be at least 30 years old, hasn't he, in the cartoon? Adam's about 20. So he's definitely an adult. So I think at times they need to find a better line between Orko being there to help us feel like we're part of the show and actually treating him like a child.
I think maybe some of the writers didn't really get it, did they?
Yes, it's another symptom of there being lots of different writers. As well as being notorious for rather limited animation techniques, Filmation employed very limited voice actors. By which I mean only 4 people really voice the regular characters on He-Man. And I actually think this adds a lot of charm to the show.
They're very diverse, of course. The main characters all have noticeably different voices, don't they?
All of them chosen for their diversity. The main voice actors, we'll just quickly reel them off. John Irwin, who played He-Man so well.
Yes, he's very good. I love the way he does the sort of cheesy lines. He does them perfectly.
Just the right amount of cheese where they sound like he's saying them sincerely, but you can hear that they're a bit stupid as well.
That's right.
Absolutely brilliant. And he voiced several other characters. Prince Adam, of course. Beastman. Ram Man. Later additions to Skeletor's Evil Crew, Whiplash, Webstore. And then we had Alan Oppenheimer, the voice of Skeletor. Such a wonderful, creepy, eerie, evil voice, but also quite an amusing voice. It certainly can be adapted very easily to be amusing. And Alan Oppenheimer also played Cringer, Battlecat, Man-at-Arms, Merman, Buzz-Off, and many others. And then we had Linda Gary, who did all the women.
Yes, the main woman, of course, is Teela, and the bad woman is Evil Lynn, which actually I used to find hilarious, did you? Because one of our aunts is called Lynn. And then in He-Man there was Evil Lynn.
There was Evil Lynn. We had Good Lynn, well, sort of.
I think she was alright. And there does come a point when there have been so many female guest stars that the voices that she gives for them become rather stupid, I think.
Yes, poor old Linda Gary having to find all those different women voices. But it's interesting about Teela and Evil Lynn. We'll go back a bit on a side note to what I was saying about differences in characters that happened between the mini-comics and adapting them into the cartoon. Evil Lynn and Teela in the mini-comics and figures are supposed to be very much polar opposites of each other. Teela is the warrior goddess of good, and Evil Lynn is the warrior goddess of evil.
I didn't know that.
And the figure of Teela has the cobra scepter, which allows her to communicate with animals. And she's very much a sort of mystical, magical figure like Evil Lyn, whereas in the cartoon, Teela becomes the daughter of Man-at-Arms, the captain of the Royal Guard, and a warrior rather than a witch, while Evil Lyn is still the witch, the evil witch. So they do use Teela and Evil Lyn in the cartoon as sort of polar opposite characters. There's a very good episode called The Witch and the Warrior where they have to team up for a bit. "We made a nice team," says Evil Lyn. But once you know that with the original toy line and mini-comics and annuals and things, Evil Lyn and Teela were actual physical polar opposites, that makes a lot more sense. Quite interesting that, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's quite.
And the other main voice actor was the show's creator and executive producer, Lou Scheimer, who was also the head of Filmation. And he voices basically any character who doesn't have another voice. And they do tend to get a bit similar at times. He voices Orko, of course, but very digitally changed. And you can hear him in something like his normal voice, voicing characters like King Randor and Stratos and Trapjaw. But he does a sterling job as well, and he's got a lot of voices to fill in along the way. Always credited as Eric Gunden, because he wanted to be known as a crew member rather than a voice actor, I understand.
Eric Gunden?
Yes.
That's random.
But then the fifth He-Man voice actor, Erica Scheimer, is Lou Scheimer's daughter, and she was drafted in to help out with the voices, but she doesn't do any regular He-Man characters, and actually she doesn't help out Linda Gary with the female voices that much. Her forte is doing young boy characters.
Well, she does a lot of voices in She-Ra, doesn't she?
Yes, indeed.
And does she do female voices in She-Ra?
Yes.
And does she do the ones that I say aren't very good? Like, what's her name? Perfumer. She had a stupid voice.
Oh, yes. She is asked to come up with quite a lot of voices for She-Ra, and perhaps she doesn't have the versatility of Linda Gary.
So maybe boys really is her strong point.
I think so. So I'll just say in closing about the original He-Man cartoon, I used to absolutely love watching it. Holiday mornings it used to be on. I used to get up and watch Whack-A-Day, and then there was He-Man, Inspector Gadget, and Vicky the Viking, usually. Sometimes She-Ra, Inspector Gadget, and Vicky the Viking, which was an absolutely wonderful thing to get up and watch in the holidays. When we were very young, you remember getting up on holiday mornings and watching that array?
Vaguely.
So it is a very long time ago, but it was wonderful. But yes, let's get on to She-Ra, which is kind of a spin-off / follow-up show. And the reason it came into being is twofold. One, there was a series of action figures that had been introduced into the Masters of the Universe toy line called the Evil Horde, led by Hordak. And in all their mini-comics, they were having adventures on Eternia with He-Man and the established characters. And they were very much part of the He-Man Eternia mythos, and they were supposed to be at one point introduced into the He-Man show. But, in the end, the Horde actually got its own show as main villains in She-Ra. So that's one reason to make She-Ra, to cram in all these extra villain action figures and have a home for the Evil Horde. The other reason is to appeal more to the female market and be able to make a series of She-Ra action figures with hair to brush, like My Little Pony, and they all had little hair brushes that came with the set, and in both ways sell more Masters of the Universe action figures.
Well, in a way I do approve of that, trying to appeal more to girls. As you say, My Little Pony was around, and Care Bears, and cartoons like that, trying to sell these incredibly wet, in inverted commas, feminine toys. I tend to prefer things which appeal to boys and girls and don't differentiate too much between the two. But She-Ra the cartoon, when I was a child, didn't strike me as being massively different from He-Man. It had the same sort of adventure and magic and kick-butt heroes, except that the main character was female and a lot of her friends and allies were female, and I approved of that because we were talking about Teela and Evil Lynn, who were the only regular women in He-Man, and it was good for me, I think, to have She-Ra and friends to aspire to. The toys, on the other hand, as Jake says, they had sort of... I think you could even undress them, couldn't you?
Yes.
In the sense that you would put clothes on Barbie, not in a pervy sense, and, as you say, brush their hair and that kind of thing. I think that was pandering to a stereotype more than the cartoon was. So again, hooray for Filmation, boo for Mattel.
Yes, I think Filmation did very much try not to alienate their He-Man audience while making the She-Ra series, and I think they do achieve that quite successfully. Many of the episodes of She-Ra have He-Man characters in them, and almost the He-Man characters are regular characters in She-Ra. Almost, but not quite. I watched all of He-Man and She-Ra recently, and I did a tally of how many She-Ra episodes had at least one character who debuted on the He-Man series in them. Now, I thought it was probably going to be about a third of the episodes of She-Ra. There's 93 episodes. I thought it was going to be somewhere around early 30s. And it actually ended up at 28, so it was a bit less than I thought, but plenty of episodes, isn't there? So whenever you read someone saying about She-Ra, oh, I think there was one crossover episode at some point, they don't know what they're talking about. It's 28 episodes of She-Ra have He-Man characters in them. And of course there's the Christmas special as well, which is a deliberate mix of characters from the two shows.
Sometimes I get you to show me the Christmas special at Christmas, and I think, oh yes, I like this, it's really funny. It's got more boring bits than I actually remember. What I like is Skeletor being hilarious and being touched by the Christmas spirit and saying, I don't know what's happening to me. I must save the children.
It's actually really funny, all the Skeletor stuff in that, and because perhaps it's the Christmas special, it doesn't damage the evilness of his character in other media.
At any other time, Skeletor would not save the children.
But it's well within the parameters of his character, extended for Christmas, which is very cleverly done.
Saving them from Hordak, isn't he?
Well, Horde Prime,
Horde Prime, right, okay, the Horde anyway, the She-Ra villains.
Perhaps we should say about She-Ra at this point that she is He-Man's twin sister.
Yes, in her speech at the beginning she goes, I am Adora, He-Man's twin sister, and I think, better be careful who you say that to.
And of course, She-Ra's opening speech is done very much in the same style as He-Man's, because Filmation knew it worked in the original cartoon and viewers lapped it up. Why not in the spin-off as well?
Unfortunately, it's not as good, is it?
It's not as good. One very big oversight is how in the He-Man one you get Cringer became the mighty Battle Cat, but in the She-Ra one you don't get Spirit, who's Adora's horse, became the mighty flying unicorn Swiftwind. You don't get Swiftwind's name from it. Terrible.
If you're not going to tell us that, you might as well not bother introducing Spirit.
My beloved steed. But yeah, Adam and Adora were twins, and the backstory that She-Ra introduces goes that Hordak stole baby Adora and took her to Etheria, where the Horde now rules, and raised her as the Horde force captain. And then Adam comes to Etheria with the second sword of Grayskull and gives it to Adora, and she becomes not evil, and thus turns into She-Ra and helps to strive to free Etheria from the evil forces of Hordak, or the evil Horde.
Her catchphrase for the transformation isn't as good, for the honour of Grayskull.
I have a couple of problems with the premise of She-Ra, as you know, well, as Rosie knows.
Yes.
You have to come in believing that the Great Rebellion is striving to free Etheria from the evil Horde, but they're not trying very hard, actually. He-Man's excuse for not going to Snake Mountain and beating up Skeletor is that He-Man never tries to start a fight and will stop evil where it rears its head, but he won't instigate conflict. Which is fine, because on Eternia, Skeletor is not in a position of power. He is trying to get into a position of power. But on Etheria, Hordak and the Horde are in the position of power. They are subjugating the planet. Now really, She-Ra and the Rebellion, and all the characters from He-Man, all the powers of Grayskull, should be a lot more proactive about quashing the Horde, not only on Etheria, but in the rest of the galaxy as well, because apparently Horde Prime has a lot of planets under his control. But they're not, because it doesn't fit in with the premise of the show. And it seems that She-Ra takes place over a large number of years, because you get the character in Season 1 who defects from the evil Horde, and then in Season 2 he's got this 4-year-old daughter. It's taking the Great Rebellion far too long to actually do anything. They're not that great at all.
I know another problem you have.
Yeah.
She-Ra's identity doesn't need to be secret. There's no reason why her allies shouldn't know that Adora is She-Ra. And some of them do. Among them are Light, Hope, Madame Raz, and Cowl, aren't they?
That's correct.
And there are some others as well. And some of them don't know, and there's not any difference between the two.
Again, this is something He-Man gets away with. Prince Adam's identity as He-Man has to be kept a secret, because Prince Adam is the Prince of Eternia. If people know he's He-Man, they will attempt to target the royal family in order to get to He-Man, which is a bit redundant because Skeletor and perhaps other villains are trying to take over the royal palace anyway at times, but they just about get away with it on He-Man.
It'll do, won't it?
It'll do, we can accept it. But on She-Ra, Adora and She-Ra are apparently both part of the Great Rebellion, and the Horde hates them both for being leaders of the Great Rebellion.
Yes, I remember, if I may say something now, thinking, well, maybe it's better that the Horde don't know Adora's She-Ra, but then you came and watched the ends of some episodes on YouTube because your DVDs were messing up.
That's right.
And I heard what was going on, and I thought, oh, well, the Horde seemed to be specifically after Adora anyway, so I guess it wouldn't matter if they knew she was She-Ra.
Yeah, they hate Adora more, really, because she's the big defector. Hordak's been a kind of father figure to her. Shadow Weaver, the evil Lynn character, has been like a mother to you, Adora, as she says. So Adora's the one they really hate and want to get at. And of course, there isn't a reason, as you were saying, that all Adora She-Ra's allies shouldn't know that they're the same person. And if you are gonna pick a couple to tell, why pick Madame Raz and Cowl, the funny koala owl bird character? It's really weird. Now, Light Hope I accept. Light Hope is She-Ra's kind of Sorceress of Castle Grayskull character.
And isn't he, as if to say, up yours to Mattel, try and make an action figure out of this?
Yes, I have heard that said, and it's very true. You can't really make a action figure out of a rainbow light that sits over a pool in the Crystal Castle.
No.
And yes, I meant to say earlier, didn't I? Adam's, He-Man's people in the secret are justified. The Sorceress, of course, knows. Sorceress of Castle Grayskull, she's the one who was guarding the swords all the years and knows all about it. Man-at-Arms knows about it because he's the main coordinator of the efforts of good on Eternia and is a sort of, well, father figure to Adam, I say. He is a sort of father figure to Adam, but Adam does have his own parents. And Orko, of course, needs to know because we need to know. And Orko is our vessel in the show. So that whole thing works a lot better on He-Man than it does on She-Ra, I tend to think.
Of course, part of the charm is that everyone is incredibly thick for not realising.
Yes, Teela would work it out in real life.
I like the bit where Battlecat totally gives himself away. Who is it who locks Cringer up?
Oh yes, Beastman and Evil Lynn have been making the plan for Skeletor where Cringer gets kidnapped, and later on Battlecat is dragging Beastman into captivity and saying,
"See how you like being locked in a cage." Whoops.
And then of course there's that one where Cringer, Orko and Ram-Man go to rescue He-Man from the parallel universe, and they come back as Battlecat, Orko and Ram-Man hasn't noticed that he's gone with Cringer and come back with Battlecat, but he's a bit thick.
As they say on the fan commentary, you would think that Ram-Man, slow as he is, would notice.
But that's all part of the fun, isn't it?
Very much so.
The other thing we'll say about She-Ra is they got a couple of new voice actors, Melody Britt to be Adora and She-Ra, and she voiced a few other characters, but she doesn't have Linda Gary's versatility. You noticed her voicing the character Mermister in a French accent.
That's right.
And she also voiced Catra, one of the Horde members.
Yes, I like Catra because she thinks she's going to be stronger if she turns into a cat. So she turns into a cat and then She-Ra kicks the crap out of her.
That's exactly right. And Caster Speller
That's a stupid name.
is also Melody Britt, but she's even reaching for voices a bit there. Oh yes, Adora! That's my impression of Caster Speller.
That's very good.
And they brought in for their main man, George DiCenzo, who's actually done a couple of He-Man guest voices uncredited before She-Ra.
Oh, I know who he is. He's Lorraine's father in Back to the Future.
The only other thing we've ever seen him in is, yes, Lorraine's dad in Back to the Future. But his voice did add a nice bit of variety to the He-Man cartoon at times, but I actually don't think his versatility on She-Ra is really up to the standard it needs to be. Certainly nowhere near John Irwin and Alan Oppenheimer.
You were slagging him off when we watched the Christmas special.
Yes, but he didn't actually do many voices in that. We didn't see him at his worst.
He did Bo and the Horde. No, not the Horde. Hordak. I really meant Hordak that time, didn't I?
Yes, that's right. He voices Bo, Hordak, and a lot of male guest stars, such as Seahawk, Adora's love interest. And then, of course, we have, from the He-Man cartoon, Erica Scheimer coming to do a lot of the female characters with hair to brush, such as Perfumer, as you mentioned, Peekaboo.
Peekaboo's a sort of peacock woman, isn't she?
Yes, with multi-vision.
That doesn't make any sense because it's male peacocks who have eye feathers.
Queen Angela, Flutterina, the butterfly woman.
I remember her.
And many others. And then, also from the He-Man show, Linda Gary came over to be a regular. She does Scorpia, a member of the Evil Horde, Madame Raz, Glimmer, both members of the Great Rebellion.
What about Madame Raz's broom, who is called Broom?
Ah, he's Lou Scheimer.
Right.
Sounds quite like Orko, really, because he's manipulated as well.
And he knows the secret, doesn't he?
And, yes, he is in on the secret. I mean, if Madame Raz is in on the secret, her sentient broom really has to be in on the secret.
Yes.
And Lou Scheimer also voices Cowl and Light Hope and Spirit and Swiftwind. Of course, Spirit couldn't talk before he became Swiftwind, but he can talk as Spirit after becoming Swiftwind. And I always think he should hide that from people who don't know the secret, but he doesn't bother in all episodes.
And are they not surprised by a talking horse?
No.
He might as well have been able to talk all along then, really.
Yes, She-Ra needs a bit more coherence, I think.
Of course, what doesn't make any sense is that Swiftwind goes off and gets another unicorn pregnant on Unicorn Island without She-Ra noticing.
That's the very last episode, Swifty's baby, and it doesn't make sense that Swiftwind's been able to fly off without She-Ra or Dora knowing. I always say, well, perhaps he could stay as a unicorn while he's on Unicorn Island, even if She-Ra turns back into a Dora. But then, of course, when he tried to fly off and come home, he turned back into Spirit and fall into the sea.
Yes, the logistics are still very tricky anyway, because it's up to her when he becomes Swiftwind, isn't it?
But the show's very much jumped the shark by then. I do think some of the Season 2 She-Ra episodes are extremely weak. There we are.
You told me after you'd watched all the DVDs that a lot of She-Ra wasn't very good, but quite a long time ago, you gave me what you considered to be some of the best episodes to watch. I didn't want to watch the whole thing. And I thought they were very good, actually, although I can't remember much about them now. I just remember that I did enjoy them.
He-Man has its stinkers as well. Of course, it's inevitable in a 130-episode series. But I do think the quality of the show overall is much higher. And yes, a best-of She-Ra DVD would probably be better. And you could get a good 40 episodes on that, I'm sure. Most of the ones with the Seahawk would probably make it on.
Yes, you showed me some of those. I thought that was quite a good ship to get into.
He has a ship, a solar ship.
Uh-huh.
Which flies as well as floats, and also he has a ship with Adora / She-Ra.
Yes, he fancies both of them, so he'll be really pleased when he finds out they're the same person.
And Adora has this scene with Madame Raz where they're discussing how Adora wants to tell Seahawk that she and She-Ra are the same person because he seemingly is in love with them both, but she can't! Now why can't she, I always say. I can't tell him they're both me, Adora goes, and I say, yes, you can if you want to. The one point I think where She-Ra really should tell Seahawk that she is actually Adora is when Seahawk wants to go back onto the exploding ship to rescue Adora, and She-Ra has to come back round the other side, turn into Adora, get back into the prison so that Seahawk can then rescue her. What she really needs to say at that point is, no, Seahawk, don't go back for Adora. I am Adora. Don't go back in there. You might get blown up. But there we go. That's a continuation of the point we've had before. Now, She-Ra came to an end after 2 seasons. The second one extremely truncated. It's only got 28 episodes rather than 65. In 1986. And by then the Masters of the Universe franchise was really waning. I don't think figure sales were doing so well. But still there was to be released the live-action movie in 1987. Now apparently this was a bit of a flop financially. And you can see why. It really, to capture the success of the Masters of the Universe franchise, should have been released at least 2 years earlier, if not 3 or 4. We first watched the Masters of the Universe movie when it premiered on BBC One, which was Christmas 1990. And we enjoyed it, and we still do. I wonder what Rosie wants to tell us about the movie.
Well, I think as a child I found it quite satisfying because it's got He-Man, Teela, Man-at-Arms, Skeletor, Evil Lyn, and the Sorceress. I think I felt that was sufficient.
And Beastman.
Oh, yes. Although he doesn't speak, he's more beastly in the film.
Very much so.
And I was disappointed that there wasn't even any mention of Prince Adam. I was thinking, well, where does He-Man come from then? Where does he live? Who do they think he is?
A lot of the film's problems, shortcomings, I think, also come from Mattel not giving them enough money and screwing them over. There's a story about how the end sequence wasn't shot and they had to come back and do it in the dark so you couldn't see the sets weren't really there 3 weeks later. So the film may look a bit cheap and rushed in places, and apparently it's set mainly on Earth because they couldn't set it mainly on Eternia because they couldn't have the money to build enough sets. But
I always thought that was so that the Earth audience could relate to it, so that actually works quite well.
Exactly. It may not have been what it was envisioned to be at first, but I think the movie still has a lot going for it. Let's talk about the cast. Now, Dolph Lundgren as He-Man may not be the greatest actor in the world, but he's got his blonde hair and his muscles, and he brings He-Man to life in a live-action form better than I originally thought would be possible, so I have no objections to him.
No, neither do I. I always was very satisfied with him as He-Man.
Frank Langella as Skeletor, absolutely brilliant.
Yes, I agree with that as well.
He's not really funny in the movie, Skeletor, but he's still within the parameters of the character of Skeletor from the cartoon. Evil, ruthless, power-hungry. And I always think that the Christmas special and the movie are the two extremes of Skeletor's character. Funny in the Christmas special, evil in the movie, and they both fit in well enough with how he is generally in the cartoon series.
Yes, very much so.
Meg Foster as Evil Lyn is rather mysterious and sinister.
Yes, I always thought she was quite good. I thought that scene with Courtney Cox where she tricks her into giving her the key was very effective.
And one thing fans of the cartoon do object to, I think, is the fact that Evil Lyn doesn't use her magic to trick and deceive in the movie as much as she always used to do in the cartoon. So that scene is one that is liked and appreciated by die-hard fans. And I am one of them. I do like that scene.
Yes.
Thank you, my darling.
Yes, that's very effective. And I think it's sufficient for a film. I don't particularly want to see her doing it all the time. I just like to see a nod to the fact that she could if she wanted to.
People also object that Orko wasn't in the film, but he'd be impossible to do floating around the whole time. So you get Gwildor instead, played by Billy Barty. And he's a dwarfish character. They make him a Thenorian, they call it, with big elf-like ears and beard. But I actually think Gwildor is a good character in the film. He has some poignant moments, doesn't he?
Yes, he's fine. It's possibly, in some ways, a little insulting, patronising to say, well, this will do instead of Orko, won't it? I don't know.
Yes, perhaps it is.
But in those days, I guess no one would have thought of that.
So I think the film certainly has its place in the Master of the Universe canon. That's funny because it's made by Canon Film.
What about the others, Teela, Man-at-Arms? Are you sort of indifferent to them? I think I am.
Yes, I am. I mean, they all do a fine job, the other not-so-main actors, but those are the ones that I always find striking, epitomise the movie for me, the ones we've talked about.
I'll tell you what I didn't like. Teela and the Sorceress not looking like they do in the cartoon.
Oh, yes, and you don't really get the sense that Teela and the Sorceress are secretly mother and daughter in the film, do you? Which is something from the cartoon that fans do enjoy.
Yes. They made an effort to make He-Man look like He-Man and Skeletor look like Skeletor. Man-at-Arms has got the right hat on and a moustache, so that I did find disappointing.
Now, there was a kind of half-hearted attempt to relaunch He-Man in the early 90s with the New Adventures of He-Man, which, of course, matched up with a new action figure toy line, but that was horribly unpopular, and I absolutely loathed it when we tried to watch it, because it looked and was completely different. The characters were all different, sounded different, looked completely different. It wasn't set on Eternia, and there's really nothing that any real He-Man wants to say about the New Adventures of He-Man, I think.
No, I remember that I hated it, but I don't remember anything about why, or actually watching it. I just remember rejecting it.
So we'll come out of the olden days now to 2002, when Mattel obviously thought it would be worth relaunching the He-Man line, completely redesigned, of course. And to go with it, there was a new cartoon series, which ran from mid-2002 to early 2004, and we managed to catch some episodes of it on CITV, and later Rosie bought the American DVD release, which is very interesting to watch and compare to the original after watching the proper show on DVD.
Yes, it is good. When I watch it now, think, why did I want these DVDs? Originally, when we watched it, I liked it quite a lot. I think, to be honest, I was seduced by its beauty. It looks absolutely lovely. And the acting and the writing and all that kind of thing is sufficient.
It is sufficient, but I do think it is noticeably not as good as the original show in terms of its characterization and writing and depth. And I used to say about newer He-Man, I don't want to call it new He-Man because it's 13 years old now. So 21st century He-Man, I always used to say that it was over-reliant on long battle sequences and was kind of showing off the fact that it could do really good animation and the old one couldn't. I now realise that was a too harsh assessment. Some episodes are light on character and plot and do have far too much screen time taken up with stupid battle sequences, particularly the two-parters, as you pointed out to me.
Yes, their material isn't actually sufficient to fill 2 parts, so they have to have some padding.
But not all episodes do that. I do actually think the new one is worse than the old one, and perhaps this is because Mattel agreed to give them more money, at squeezing in as many action figures as it can. There's at least 5 different He-Man action figures showcased in the 39 episodes of newer He-Man.
That's pretty crazy, isn't it?
I do think the old show had more integrity about not putting in battle armor He-Man and samurai armor He-Man and ice He-Man. They just kept He-Man looking the same all the way through.
Of course, Mattel kind of had to give them more money because children, I nearly said nowadays, it's in those days, isn't it? 21st century children expect more from animation than Filmation was able to give. They expect it to look nice. They expect He-Man and Prince Adam not to look exactly the same. So perhaps in exchange for a bit more money, they had to agree to cram in more toys.
I think that's very likely. And of course they have a lot more different voice actors in the newer one than in the old one, which I think takes away some of the charm in a way.
Of course, Prince Adam and He-Man are played by Cam Clarke, who's very good.
A very, very familiar voice. Very famous as Leonardo and Rocksteady from the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And we enjoy him as Dogtanian, which I'm sure we'll talk about one day in the not-too-distant future.
Definitely. He's brilliant in that, and I think you said to me that you thought he'd used his Dogtanian to influence his Prince Adam, sort of immature, young, teenaged voice.
Yes, the newer show does take a different route with Prince Adam. He's visibly and emotionally younger in it than in the old show, and when he becomes He-Man in the newer show, I always think, as well as the physical change, it does bring out a kind of emotional change, so that Prince Adam is less of a disguise in the new one than he is in the old one.
I think you could argue, if you wanted to say anything was better in the new one, that the symbolism and the ideas about growing up is better in that sense.
Yes, it certainly does have its advantages.
I like the way that Cringer and Battlecat are the same character, and some writers, particularly Larry DiTillio, who writes the best episodes and wrote original He-Man, goes to lengths to show that Battlecat and Cringer have the same emotions and they're a part of each other.
Larry DiTillio also brought in Orko's original backstory to the new cartoon and demonstrated how he should be used in the show. Many of the writers of New He-Man don't seem to know what to do with Orko, and in a lot of episodes he does come across as annoying and pointless. So that was a good contribution from Larry DiTillio as well.
Definitely, yes, that is annoying how Orko is treated. The scene I always remember is where everybody's testing some sort of new machine that freezes you or something, and Orko comes flying in going, "Hey guys, what's going on?" and gets zapped by it. Very irritating.
One thing that I think is very well achieved in the newer He-Man is Skeletor, the character. He is less comical than in the original show, but his new voice actor, who I believe is Brian Dobson, or is it Paul Dobson? They're brothers and they're both in the show. I think it's Brian Dobson. Does get as much humour out of the new Skeletor when it's appropriate as possible, and I do enjoy a lot of Skeletor's dialogue in New He-Man. Of course, I'd much rather have Alan Oppenheimer's Skeletor any day, but I do think Skeletor is a very good part of New He-Man. Probably my favourite character in it. I think the main advantage I feel New He-Man has is that instead of lazily trying to adapt ideas from the old cartoon, it does go back to the original source material, the mini-comics, and ideas that didn't make it into the original cartoon, and adapts them into the new cartoon very well. For example, they managed to get in the evil character Stinkor, who was an absolutely pathetic action figure who was supposed to be stinky and was a reuse of the Merman mould and never actually made it into the original show. But in the new show, they introduced Stinkor into the story in a funny and believable way, which I think is very well done.
They certainly put a lot of effort into it, I think.
What makes it really noticeable that they've gone back to the source material and really thought about how to make the new show is that you get the Horde included in the backstory of New He-Man, and you get Hordak as a kind of semi-regular antagonist in Season 2, someone who's hovering on the fringes trying to get back into power on Eternia, and you get appearances from Leech, Mantenna and Grislaw, who of course we all think of as She-Ra characters, but actually they're really part of the He-Man backstory.
You've given up on not calling it New He-Man, haven't you?
Yes, it just slips out. But even more interesting than that, perhaps, is the fact that they went back to the original toy line and put the Snake Men in New He-Man. Newer He-Man. Now, the Snake Men action figures were released long after original He-Man cartoon had reached the height of its popularity, and two of the Snake Men did actually make incongruous rather bad, misused appearances in She-Ra as members of the Horde. That's Ratlaw and Tongue Lasher. And Cobra Khan, of course, was a regular character in original He-Man, one of Skeletor's evil warriors.
Obviously.
But he wasn't a Snake Man. They hadn't thought of the Snake Man when Cobra Khan was introduced as a character. In the original cartoon, he's actually a Repton, which is a group of snake-like creatures.
But not Snake Men.
No, they're not evil like the Snake Men. They're actually very peaceful, and Cobra Khan is a renegade, which is an idea they kind of use with Whiplash, actually, in the newer He-Man. But the Snake Men are very significant to new He-Man, aren't they? Because they become the main antagonists in the second two-thirds of Season 2, and the show actually gets renamed Masters of the Universe versus the Snake Men. Now, much as I appreciate the attempt to bring in the Snake Men from the old mythology to the new cartoon, acknowledging the old Eternia backstory and incorporating it, I do think that having the Snake Men kind of replacing Skeletor and his evil warriors as the main antagonists in the show is a bad move.
I do remember being very unimpressed with that and thinking perhaps it wasn't worth buying the third DVD. But then I did because the second one ends in the cliffhanger, so you need the third one. And actually it has its moments, doesn't it, that last DVD?
Yes, the third DVD release you need because the first third of Season 2 is actually very good. It's still Skeletor being the main antagonist. It's the conclusion to the exciting cliffhanger from Season 1. There's a lot of interesting stuff with Skeletor's backstory and evil in there. But it's the last few episodes, even though they introduce Fisto, who Rosie likes.
Do I?
Yes. That are extremely weak, and the Snake Men, King Hiss as the main villains, I don't think works nearly as well as Skeletor.
I do find Fisto very memorable for some reason.
Probably because he has that giant fist.
What I find memorable is him sitting in the bar getting laughed at for having an actual giant fist, and then his hand gets broken, and Man-at-Arms has to make him a new one.
Yes, what they do in the newer He-Man is they make him Man-at-Arms' brother, which is quite interesting. Whereas in the old series, he's just introduced in Season 2 as a kind of new heroic character who just randomly got a huge metal fist. They do make an effort in the new one to tie in the new characters they're introducing in a more believable way. Another example of that is Cyclone, who has this huge introductory episode in newer He-Man, whereas in the old one he just turns up in a couple of later episodes making whirlwinds with no explanation. And Roboto, who in the new one is a chess-playing robot who wants to be a warrior and thus becomes one, whereas in the old one he's just a guest star, although it's quite a good episode with him. Happy birthday, Roboto. Thinking about what makes us human. But I do think... I suppose the newer He-Man, of course, had the advantage of the characters already existing, so it could plan to include them believably in the universe, rather than Mattel coming along and saying, right, new action figure, put it in the cartoon.
Yes, as I've said and you've said, Filmation really did do their very best, and newer He-Man did have that advantage, and I think they made the best of it. They did put a lot of effort in. It does have some interesting ideas, such as Battle Cat's hat coming off. That happened twice, both Larry DiTilio episodes, and we like to speculate that he always wanted to do it in the olden days and wasn't allowed to because of the limitations of animation and the fact that he would have just been Cringer.
Yes, if old Battle Cat's hat comes off, he's just Cringer. Whereas in the new one, because Cringer grows so much to become Battle Cat, he can take his hat off and not look like Cringer. Although the old Cringer does grow a little to become Battle Cat, but not very much.
Yes, well, the animation wouldn't have been up to it anyway. But new Battle Cat, I always thought was incredibly cool. He's like a sort of saber-toothed tiger, and he has these massive shoulders and tiny head like the Smilodon skeletons that you see.
Of course, Battle Cat was originally conceived as a kind of wild, saber-toothed creature that He-Man kind of had a psychic connection with and sort of semi-tamed. So that, again, was probably going back to the source material and thinking about how to design the character. It's worth mentioning now that the characters of He-Man and Battle Cat are older concepts than the characters of Prince Adam and Cringer. And sometimes if you find an old Ladybird book or something, it doesn't realise that Battle Cat is Cringer and lives at the palace with Prince Adam. I think there's one where Prince Adam turns into He-Man and then goes into the forest and calls upon his friend, the mighty Battle Cat. So you can see that there's a progression there in the backstory of the characters.
I must have found that very puzzling as a child. I wouldn't have liked that.
Yes, Ladybird books, colouring books, mini-comics, annuals, they all have different versions of the status quo than the cartoon does. One particular one is Castle Grayskull in any sort of printed media is usually the bastion of all the good guys, and the toy very much reflects this. It has things like the weapons room and the computer room and the spaceport and things, whereas in the cartoon it's the mysterious, quite sparsely furnished home of the sorceress and the secrets of the universe that you have there.
Can I say something about New Teela?
Yeah.
What a bitch! We talked on the Ghostbusters podcast about how Ghostbusters didn't fall into the trap of having strong women be strong just by being aggressive to everybody, and neither did Filmation's He-Man, but newer He-Man, Teela's just horrible.
Coming back to the point we were making on our last podcast, Teela and Adam are supposed to have, in newer He-Man, a kind of love-hate relationship, and it is hard to spot where the love comes from.
Yes, as you said last time, the girl just hates the boy, and yes, she does.
It's interesting how in New He-Man, Teela actually does work out that Adam and He-Man are the same person, and then just sort of forgets it and doesn't really come back to it. It's in the one with the dragon, where the dragon recognises He-Man as Prince Adam, who helped her earlier. And Man-at-Arms tries to fob Teela off, and she's not really buying it.
Oh, yes, interesting. It's a shame they don't do the relationship properly. It's annoying. Writers nowadays can't distinguish between a strong, assertive woman and just getting cross with people for no reason.
The other interesting thing about the newer Teela is that she has a cobra scepter, which she uses as a weapon, whereas Teela in the old cartoon, you'll never see her holding a cobra scepter. But I don't think Teela in the new cartoon has sort of magical power over animals and things with her scepter. Although Teela does have certain innate powers, as she is secretly the daughter of the sorceress, and one day she will become the sorceress of Grayskull, which is a common underlying story in both versions of the cartoon. I noticed this time, when I watched them, of course, that what is an underlying story in the old cartoon and not in the new one is that Queen Marlena, Adam and Adora's mother, King Randor's wife, I haven't mentioned her name until now, is from Earth and was an astronaut and has crash-landed on Eternia and married King Randor and had this family. So He-Man and She-Ra are both half American. But they don't bother with that in the new series. There's not really time. Queen Marlena is horribly underused in the new series, and they just don't really get round to it. So in conclusion, Masters of the Universe has been a varied and lucrative franchise over the years. Something I absolutely loved as a child and Rosie watched.
Yes, I think I enjoyed it.
Something that we both came back to in the early part of the 21st century and found interesting to compare. And something that I always enjoy watching through, even though it takes about 6 months, every 6 months or so. As a final point, you might be wondering if either of us ever bought any of the He-Man action figures or She-Ra action figures. The answer is yes, but mostly we used to get them second hand for £1.25 each from a toy shop called Young Ones, which had some new toys, but mostly second hand ones. And they used to be missing weapons and body armour and things, but it was a great way to make a He-Man collection, wasn't it? And it shows how perhaps the toy line was getting past its peak of popularity by then, the fact that a lot of the action figures were being donated to the local second-hand shop.
There were always plenty to choose from, weren't there? And they used to be standing up in the window, I suspect, especially for you.
Yes, just for me. Yes, I've got pretty much a full collection of characters from the show bought from Young Ones. But actually, there was one Master of the Universe action figure that I got new, with the mini-comic and all the packaging, and can you remember which one it was?
No.
Shall we run a competition, see if everyone wants to write it? The answer is, in fact, Grislaw, a member of the Evil Horde.
Well, I would never have remembered that.
So there we are, a very interesting side point there. So I think that brings our Masters of the Universe podcast to an end, don't you?
Yes, I think so.
Join us again next time for our 4th podcast, which will be on the subject of
Alvin and the Chipmunks, a favourite of mine.
Do join us for that. You'll enjoy it about as much as you've enjoyed this, I expect. And until then, good night out there.
Whatever you are.